Welcome back to Season 6 of the Group Practice Accelerator podcast, brought to you by Polaris Healthcare Partners, where we leverage decades of healthcare and business experience to drive growth in successful group practices just like yours. If you're a healthcare entrepreneur and you're interested in building, scaling, or exiting your group practice, you've found not only the industry's leading resource for business education, but a team of trusted advisors dedicated to helping you achieve and exceed your goals. In short, the team at Polaris creates clarity, confidence, and results. I'm your host, Jamie Falash, and the Group Practice Accelerator podcast is on the air. Hey everyone, thanks for joining me again this week. We've been putting out a lot of content lately focusing on how to maximize the value of your practices before you go to market, why and how waiting can be detrimental to the outcome of your sale, and really driving home what listeners need to know about going to market. But what we haven't talked about in this season 6 is what happens once the LOI is signed. So today we're going to dive into that process from LOI to closing, including what's happening behind the scenes, what that process should and shouldn't look like, best practices for moving the deal along, and even some deal killers that can kind of pop up along the way, because we want to avoid those, of course. So first, we're going to make some assumptions. We're ready, and when I say ready, I mean we've worked together to ensure that we're presenting a great product with steady growth potential for buyers. We've been deep into your financials and operations and culture, and we've created a compelling pitch deck to put out in front of like-minded partners and our buyers. And we'll assume that now you've landed on one that aligns with your plan as a founder and your future goals. The LOI is reviewed, modified if needed, and signed. So now what? Well, who better to lay out what's next than an expert that sees this process through every step of the way from LOI to closing and even beyond than founder and partner of Your Dental Lawyer, Rob Montgomery. Rob, good to see you again. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Jamie. It's good to be back.
Yeah, been a little while, so I'm excited to have this conversation with you. And I threw a little trick into the intro there because I know you like to be involved in the LOI process, right?
I do. It's true.
Which
We
is,
since we inherit the LOI, yes, we do
yes.
like to have a little say in it.
Yeah, because it is important to have someone like you look over this and make sure that it is covering your best interests as the seller. So I threw a little trick in there, but yes, it is not just LOI, it's before the LOI.
Yeah.
So yeah, put the cart before the horse a little bit there, but it does happen. Obviously, we see people after the fact.
It happens a lot. And I just speak to that briefly. It's just that and I think people fall into the trap because people are saying, "Don't worry, it's not binding. It's not binding. Just sign that." And the reality is, you still have to that they are the terms of the deal. And even though that means that the contract doesn't, there's no contract, you can't sue somebody if it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
It can actually derail the deal if there are things that are in there or not in there. So like this is the time to kind of nail it down. And there are people that are interested parties in the transactions that would like to see that LOI signed so that the ball is advanced. And sometimes it's better to pump the brakes and let's get involved and make sure that we've got what we need to have in that LOI to ensure a smoother transaction going forward.
Agree. And I think in the interest of transparency, you want to come with your best foot forward and iron out some little details, in that LOI that could come up and derail things along the way. So I like that you're involved early on. Let's get that LOI in front of you before it's signed. All right. So I'm going to start with kind of a broader question. From your perspective and your experience, what actually happens between the LOI and closing that most dentists don't fully understand?
Well, a lot. I mean, and that's where the deal begins. I
Yeah.
think, when we get hired by people that don't have experience hiring lawyers for these transactions, which is most of our clients.
Mhm.
Oftentimes there's an expectation that we are just in charge of the documents. Where's the agreements? How much will it cost to prepare an agreement? Like, well, that's obviously an important part of what we do because without agreements, we don't have deals and we don't have closings. But it's a very small part of what's the most important stuff that we're doing, which is really solving problems and coordinating and making sure that the things that need to be done are getting done in a timely way. We're trying to uncover the surprises, trying to flesh out issues before they become bigger problems or before they become delays for the deal. So, and that's where every deal is different. Because every deal has different challenges and concerns, but there's definitely a few categories of things that we can talk about that can be potentially problematic.
Definitely. And why don't we start with just the process in general? So we give some transparency to listeners who might not be familiar with all that goes on behind the scenes. Let's start with LOI and go through closing kind of on a high level. And then I'm going to have a whole bunch of questions for you.
Sounds good. Yeah. So most of the time, a buyer's counsel would be the one preparing the initial drafts of the agreements.
Mhm.
So, typically we're looking at an asset purchase agreement, depending if you're selling to a dentist or a DSO. We'll talk about that in a minute. Two very different paths to selling a practice. But typically, the purchase agreements, the employment agreement, if you're going to stay on to provide clinical services after the closing, all those things are prepared by the buyer's counsel, the initial drafts. And then seller's counsel reviews those agreements, makes changes, comments, and would typically confer with their seller client. The only document that wouldn't always necessarily be prepared by buyer's counsel would be the lease. So if you are a seller of the practice and you also own the real estate, but you're not selling the real estate to the purchaser of the practice, that purchaser is going to enter into a commercial lease. So that's something that the seller's counsel, as the landlord, should be preparing. Now, a lot of times at DSO deals, we have to manage the expectation from the buyer that we'll have to use their form of lease, which that's not our preference.
Mhm.
The irony is, if you're selling your practice to a DSO, you will get a suite of long and sophisticated documents that are somewhat over lawyered, and then you will get an 8-page complete piece of junk lease that is so unsophisticated you'd be better printing it off the internet. It's like, well, wait a second, why are all of these documents so good and this one so bad? But oftentimes though, but that's part of one of the reasons why we do like to be involved in the LOI, because if we can, we want to provide in that LOI that we're going to work with our seller slash landlord's form of initial draft lease. Because we can get that in the LOI, then that means that's going to happen. And it gives our client an advantage in the situation. And a lot of times when we talk about who's preparing the first draft, obviously these are still negotiated documents, but there are certain documents that are protecting certain parties in different ways, and because of that, that party's counsel should be the one that's doing the initial draft, just from an efficiency standpoint and ultimately a quality and getting a deal done standpoint.
Okay. And while we're on these agreements, can you tell listeners what are the most heavily negotiated terms in the purchase agreement? I'm sure there are specific ones that you spend more time on than the others.
Yeah, it really depends. And it also depends on who the buyer is. So if you're looking at selling to a dentist or more of a private transaction, things that need to get flushed out, possibly indemnification provisions, more specifically representations and warranties. These are things that you're saying are true and correct about your practice. And so a buyer wants to have those be as broad as possible, and a seller wants those to be as limited as possible. I will say though, generally, especially in a doctor to doctor deal, as a seller, there's really a few things that you should really focus on. You want to
Okay.
make sure that you get paid. You want to make sure that there's nothing in the agreement that could allow you to lose the money that you were paid, and you want to make sure that the non-compete is consistent with what you're looking to do after the sale of the practice. That's the stuff that matters the most for a seller. And I think we encourage our seller clients not to get bogged down on some details that aren't as important. We refer to as the dreaded P word, which is the principle. When I have a client say, "But yeah, Rob, but it's just the principle of this."
Mm.
Hey, Doc, we're trying to sell your practice for $3.5 million. Let's not get too caught up in the principles. Let's
Yeah.
get this deal done, and not worry about whether or not you feel like it's quote unquote you're winning or it's fair. But those three things that I say, that's what matters the most. And it's different if you're on the buyer side. You have to make sure that you're getting what you're paying for, that you understand what the contracts are, the accounts receivable, all that stuff. But From a seller side, those are the three main principles, and that's really what should drive that process from your side.
Well, and while we're talking about that, let's look at the liabilities. If I'm the buyer, what liabilities can transfer to me if they're not properly handled? Because my mind is going to things like compliance problems after closing. I know we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves in the process here, but it just popped into my head. You know,
Yeah.
billing audits, stuff like that that can come up after closing.
Yeah, there really isn't much in an asset purchase. And again, an asset purchase, you are buying the assets, not the liabilities.
Right.
The things that kind of go wrong or the things that could come up that aren't what you expected really cause you more like operational headaches
Hmm.
than true liability per se. And again, if we're just talking about a deal with a DSO, they treat those transactions more like a stock sale and purchase with their indemnifications and the protections that they're looking for. And with that, they want to have holdbacks and escrows for the what ifs, which frankly are very remote. We don't see that as much in doctor to doctor deals in those transactions. It's indemnity escrows are a lot less common. They're dealt with more like a true asset purchase where the buyer knows, hey, I'm not assuming any liabilities. I still want to make sure that if anything pops up, I'm protected, but we're not going to over plan for that. DSOs frequently will overplan for the what ifs with the potential, which is a very small potential of liability in that transaction.
That's where my head was going with it. Just, how things are handled after the fact, because we do get questions on that. So thanks for covering that aspect. Now, all right, so we've talked about some of the agreements, and let's maybe roll into due diligence, right? What are some of the red flags that you uncover during diligence in these deals?
Yeah, so the biggest thing is the real estate. When you're looking at uh, issues that come up with the lease, especially if they're third party leases. The buyer obviously needs to be the tenant in the space after the deal,
Mm.
and so bad lease assignment language in a third party lease is that's the number one deal killer that we see.
Uh,
Once you have bad lease assignment language in your lease, that means that, and when I say bad, that means in our world that the landlord has a say. The landlord has to consent to the transfer of your lease to the buyer of your practice. We don't like that. We would
yeah.
rather see that that
Right.
happens. Well, I will tell you, Jamie, a majority of the time, if you're not working with somebody that understands this issue at the time you sign the lease and they're advising you this, majority of the time, a commercial lease will say this lease cannot be assigned without the landlord's consent.
Yeah.
Sometimes it'll say, which shall not be unreasonably withheld. Okay. What I think is unreasonable, what you think is unreasonable, what a landlord thinks is unreasonable, what a judge thinks is unreasonable, what a buyer thinks is unreasonable are all different things.
Yes.
So as soon as you have that, you've just given your landlord a seat at the table. So we would rather have language that says that notwithstanding anything to the contrary in this lease, the tenant shall be permitted to assign this lease to a purchaser of the practice who shall accept this lease and blah blah blah. That's what we want. This is where and especially if you have a situation where you have a group of practices, multiple locations, multiple landlords, the more landlords you have, the more chefs in the kitchen, the greater the likelihood that you're going to be dealing with a one-off wacko.
Mhm.
And we see that. Here it is. We've got a client, they're selling a practice. They have 8 locations, 7 landlords are on board. One
Ugh,
landlord says, I don't like DSOs. Like, well, okay. What does that mean? You
it's
know,
rude.
uh, yeah, we're dealing with that right now,
Oh, goodness.
and
Wow.
and they're trying to extract their pound of flesh. And we had a deal that should have closed 6 plus weeks ago. We're still talking about it and trying to work through this landlord. And the reason why this landlord has this seat at the table is because the lease was not done properly, and it gave this landlord a seat at the table. And if you have landlords out there. One of them's probably going to be an opportunist. Don't be surprised. So that's a really big thing from a due diligence sort of deal success closing challenge.
I will tell you that one of the things that makes me cringe, and it made me cringe as a paralegal in my stint doing that years ago, is subjective language in a legal
Yeah,
document.
yeah.
How do you make this a binding agreement or at least an ironclad agreement between anyone and protect anyone with subjective language like that? How do you make 7 landlords happy? And is this one of those principal things that you were talking about? What's the deal with I don't like DSOs?
Yeah, well, that's a landlord just being yeah, that's a principal thing, right? Yeah. It's just a crackpot, and so some of it is truly just dealing with a difficult individual, and sometimes it's just somebody that wants to extract better lease terms or higher rent escalators and things like that. So yeah, it's a problem, and the bigger the enterprise, the more locations, the bigger the deal, the greater the likelihood. So you really have to be careful about that stuff and guard that issue as you're buying practices, doing de novos, extending your lease when you if you're a practice owner and it comes time to renew your lease, every time you renew a lease, that's an opportunity to renegotiate everything in
Yes.
there, with the landlord. So if you know you're going to be transacting at some point in the not too distant future, and it's time to renew your lease, that's where you want to say to the landlord, yeah, I'll renew the lease, but we need to fix these things that could be challenges for when I go to transition my business.
You just repeated the exact words that Ryan Gillespie spoke on last week's episode from
Uh-huh.
Car Realty. So we're all in the same cheerleading section here.
I like the car people. We do lots with car people, and as I
Yes.
said, like that's it. Yep.
Like minds.
Yep.
Yeah, we
Uh-huh.
have to support each other and really do what's in the best interest of the client. But
Yeah.
outside, if we're not looking at the lease portion, how often do deals get renegotiated after diligence? Like, and what typically would trigger something like that?
Again, this is a tale of two deals. Private sale,
Yeah.
rarely. DSO sale, somewhat frequently. I think a lot of times DSOs have put a number out that is conditional on confirming those numbers through the quality of earnings through their due diligence. And
Mhm.
so that kind of is sort of a running thing up until the closing potentially. So not uncommon for them to say, sorry, this isn't quite what we thought it was. But even when that happens, this is where really working with good consultants and a good team is just essential because when that DSO says, yeah, we did our QOE and it's not what we thought, so we're going to reduce the purchase price. You
Yeah.
need your people to say, whoa, 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 hold on. That's not right. Let me see your work. Why do you think this? No, you can't add that back. That's not flying. That these numbers aren't any different. You're just trying to spin it. You need your sell side consultants, your brokers, your CPAs, your lawyers to go to bat for you. You just can't take that as the word that that the EBITDA isn't what we thought it was. That yes, it probably is. And here's why. But that so that we do see that those deals get retreated.
Well, and on that same note, are there any good ways for sellers to prepare for due diligence and avoid some of these delays? I know some of it can't be avoided, like we were talking
Yeah,
about the lease. A lease is, well, it's got to be dealt with, but anything in advance that they can start thinking about before this whole process.
yeah. I think the biggest challenge for a seller with the due diligence is just the process in some of these
Mhm.
deals. Again, tale of two different deals. Dentist deal, not so bad. Selling to a DSO, it's very challenging to respond to the requests for due diligence if you don't have somebody on your team or somebody assisting you to respond to those requests. And then we see, I feel bad for docs and they're going through this where you get a due diligence checklist that's an Excel spreadsheet that's 10 pages long asking for all kinds of stuff. And
Right.
here you have a doctor who's a chairside dentist who's trying to treat their patients, trying to run their business, and then we've got this little extra credit project that's thrown on top of it. And a lot of times they would rely on their office manager and other employees to help them with these types of things. However, I don't want to necessarily tell my team yet because I don't know if this is actually going to happen. So now you're kind of left out on the island trying to manage these requests without having this assistance. And, that's not really legal or financial. It's just practical. It's
Yeah.
a challenge. And I don't really have a solution for that other than it would be helpful if you have people that are family members or friends or consultants, other people that you really can get involved to take some of that load off of you to help just transmitting information, printing reports, sending it. And then they say they want this, but you've already sent it, but you have to send it again. And like they forget what they got and it's not quite right. And it can be really, really time consuming and stressful for that to happen. So I would say, strategize, like, figure out and talk to your team. Like how much time do you think I'm going to need to allocate to be responsive to these requests?
Yeah.
And we see some docs that are able to manage that well, and we see some that are not at all. And unfortunately, the people that are working on these deals, their whole job is this deal. Our clients who are the sellers, they have this whole other business that they're running and they're also practicing the profession. They don't have time at on a Tuesday at 3 o'clock just to take a few hours to do something or to jump on a call. So all this stuff ends up happening at nights and weekends. And so I would just say like try to develop some sort of strategy or team to be able to manage or help you manage the due diligence request
Yeah.
part of the project.
Absolutely. And hopefully you've got, trusted people within your organization. Maybe that's an office manager, maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's a director of operations. Just get some support and lay out a game plan. Who's going to answer these and how often? And let's keep track of what's been shared so we're not having to reproduce the same work over and over. And when you're trying to practice dentistry.
I don't
Okay.
envy them. Yeah, I feel bad for them in that. And sometimes we feel like, geez, we sent that to him 4 days ago. Like, yeah, well, this guy's got a lot going on.
Yeah, exactly. He's still practicing dentistry.
Yeah.
That's what keeps the value of the business going, right?
Mhm. And meanwhile, the 10 lawyers on the other side, where's the response? Where's the response? Like, yeah, it's coming. I'll tell you.
Eventually.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so we've talked about LOI, we've talked about agreements and diligence. What's next?
I think also kind of in the tail end of diligence, and this is kind of take us into kind of like the pre-closing stuff,
Yeah.
knowing what liens are on the practice, lien searches, these all are going to need to be paid off. So trying to get out in front of that, have that list. Who are these lenders? Are the payoff letters? Do you have payoff letters? If not, when are they going to be requested? How long is it going to take? How are we going to pay those people? Wire instructions. Silly detail, but this can be a problem. And sometimes people get to the closing on or the eve of it, and then they say, "Well, I don't know who National Leasing is. I bought a chair from Patterson and financed it with them, but then that paper's been sold, and that paper's been sold, and now we're trying to track down the ultimate lien holder, or sometimes liens and loans have been paid off previously, but not satisfied. So then trying to track down those lenders to get the satisfaction pieces to make sure that they can be closed. Because if you don't have those, then that could delay or cancel a closing.
Yeah, the whole financial side of it's a completely different animal, which, of course, adds in a layer of potential delays and preparation that we could probably spend 2 hours talking about that
Yeah.
aspect of it.
And here you go. Spoiler alert, time is the killer of all deals.
Yes.
So when something happens that causes things to be delayed or take more time, that's when they start to drift away and the potential for the deal to fall through starts to increase exponentially.
And that kinda leads me to I have a couple more questions, but one of them was on that deal killer front. What's the one mistake that you see over and over again from maybe docs that are in their first transaction, but they intend to keep going? This is part of a larger strategic plan. Maybe they're selling one location. and they're going to buy again. So, what would you like to see them avoid with their next sale?
Oh, wow. It's a good question. I mean, I don't think that docs necessarily make mistakes when they sell. I mean, the biggest mistake that I see people making, frankly, are they're not legal. They're financial all the time.
Yeah,
We tell people like, we could do the best piece of legal work in the history of the world. We can't make a bad deal good. And
good
so
point.
if you're doing something, you're selling something, you're buying something, you're bringing a partner on, you're partnering, you're hiring an associate, any of these decisions have cash flow implications. And knowing what they are or projecting what they are before you do it is just crucial. So, if and that goes with if you're selling the practice, if you're dropping insurance, all this stuff. So the mistakes that we see made are by people that didn't take that step to do proper cash flow analysis to understand what this means to them. So I mean, I would say that that's a big thing across the board. I guess the other thing too, if you're talking about a seller that owns a group of practices and you're going to sell one, which is that's sort of, I wouldn't say it's unusual, but not as common, obviously.
Hmm.
Normally, if you're going to maximize the overall value of your practice group, you want to sell it all together. But a potential hang up with that is what's your lender? What's their take on this? They have a lien likely on everything.
Yeah.
So if you sell one of your practices for $1 million, what happens to that $1 million? Do you get to keep that $1 million? Do you have to use that to pay down a loan for the overall credit facility that this practice is collateral for? Some combination of that. So I think that's, I wouldn't say a mistake, but certainly something that can be a challenge. And some of that too comes up with how were your loans documented? How were they structured? How are they collateralized? And that's going to dictate how easy it's going to be to skin off one or two practices and what that looks like.
Yeah, and sorry I threw that one at you because we've seen a couple of these, and I know it's not a super common scenario, but it does happen.
But as here we are in the spring of 2026, there are practices that are not, groups that are not performing super great that
Yeah.
are looking to sell off less profitable offices or offices that are just not as good for strategic reasons. So
Yeah.
we are seeing more of that recently too. So since you mentioned that, it's true, and probably at least in the near future, probably more of that to come.
Yeah, and maybe not one, maybe it's a handful of them. But yeah, thanks for covering that. Okay, so we've arrived at closing, right?
Yeah.
First of all, let's talk about the closing process and maybe last minute surprises right before closing and what we can do to avoid those.
Mm. I'm happy to say but our clients never have last minute surprises at
I like
close.
it.
Never,
What
never,
never happened.
never. We've covered and planned for everything, Jamie. I don't know
First rate
what you're
question.
talking about. No such thing. Um, no, I think it's just really as much as anything, it's just preparation and knowing what to expect. And your legal team should be managing the situation and communicating expectations to you as to what you're going to need to do and when. I think that we've observed over the years where clients are sort of insufficiently staffed in that regard, where they have lawyers that don't have a big enough team or bench to help kind of cover a deal, and a lot of papers flying back and forth in the 11th hour, literally the 11th hour sometimes,
Yeah.
and they're oftentimes on a large deal. There are a lot of lawyers that are on that buyer side,
Mhm.
and it's kind of like playing basketball. And if you want to go out on the court and play 1-on-5, it's
Mm,
probably not going to work out so well for you. So
no.
really making sure that you have a firm that is capable of handling your transaction and staffing it in a way that they're able to cover everything and do it so that that you're being taken care of and so that expectations are being conveyed. I mean, things do change and happen, and we sometimes get frustrated, especially where you have a very aggressive buyer that says, "We're closing on Friday." Like it's Tuesday. Like, you don't have enough. to close on Friday. We've got some more issues. We want to close fast too. Friday's not going to happen because that's just going to lead to a fire drill for our client and for us. And our client, as we're talking about, they're seeing patients for the rest of the week. And so if we're going to have to deal with issues or solve problems or get them involved, we just can't. So let's be realistic with when we're closing and push it back a few days. But really, I think as much as anything, it's just really important to make sure you're communicating with your team, specifically your legal team. When is this going to happen? How am I going to sign documents? Realistically, I mean, you're going to be signing via DocuSign, but when is that going to happen? What do you need from me? When will I receive those documents? Just communicate and ask those questions. They're reasonable questions to ask. You should be able to get acceptable answers to those. Funny, I had a new client, sweetheart of a guy, engaged us just yesterday. Said, "Now, Rob, will you be at the closing?" I said, "Not floating around outer space. Like we don't do those anymore. Like that's back in like the '90s, where a bunch of people
Yeah,
sit around a table and pass around documents that are like that thick, and nobody really knows what's even in them anymore because they've been
exactly.
printed, right?" So yeah, all this stuff happens remotely. If there is a real estate component, a sale of real estate, sometimes you may be at a table in a title
Yeah,
company signing things, but even that is kind of becoming a thing of the past too.
absolutely. Well, Rob, thanks so much for going through this process with us. We have so many people that want to go to market, but we also get a ton of questions about just help us with the process. So we appreciate you going through that with us today. What's the best way to get in touch with you for our listeners if they want to reach out?
Yeah, easiest way is just to go to our website, yourdentallawyer.com, and we have a form in there that you could submit and ask questions, and myself or somebody from my team will get back to you and schedule a call and chat about how we can help you.
You have the easiest URL to remember, but I'm still going to put it in the show notes so everyone can.
Appreciate that.
And to all of you, we love the questions that you send us, so keep them coming and we'll keep delivering the content that you ask us for. As always, if you want to learn about any of our Polaris expert advisory services, or maybe there's a topic that we haven't covered or even covered lately that you want to hear about, you can send us an email to info@polarishealthcarepartners.com, and be sure to visit our website at polarishealthcarepartners.com, where you'll find weekly articles to grow and support your healthcare business, along with access to all of our podcast episodes, events, and a whole lot more. Thanks so much for being a loyal listener and subscriber. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a colleague and be sure to leave us a rating on any of your favorite podcast platforms. We'll see you on the next episode of the Group Practice Accelerator Podcast.